Welcome to the Tenant Law Podcast, where we talk about new, interesting, and/or important legal cases affecting New York City tenants. This weekly pod will be about 10 minutes long. First, we give you some background so you have the context that you need to understand the case we are discussing. Then we talk about the case itself, and finally, we explain why the case is important and give you our tenant takeaway. I am Michelle Idkowitz, and today we look at Queens Fresh Meadows LLC versus Farrar, a fairly recent Queens Housing Court case. Let's start with our context. If you're living with a rent-stabilized tenant, for example, if your parents are rent stabilized and you continue to live with them after you become an adult, or your sister is rent stabilized and you move in with her, and the rent stabilized tenant later moves out, you may be able to become the new rent stabilized tenant of the apartment, even though you were never on the lease. It's called succession rights. You would succeed to the apartment after the rent stabilized tenant leaves. Now, for succession to work, number one, you need to be a family member of the rent stabilized tenant or like a family member. And two, you must have resided with the rent stabilized tenant as a primary resident in the apartment for 2 years immediately before the permanent departure of that rent stabilized tenant. The 2 years goes down to 1 year if you're disabled or a senior citizen. Now, during the overlap period between the rent stabilized tenant and the occupant, the potential successor has to live in the apartment as their primary residence. But there's some disagreement between judicial departments about what the relationship of the rent stabilized tenant has to be to the apartment during that overlap period. Does the rent stabilized tenant have to be there all the time? It depends on the court that you're in, and that's a discussion for another day. But what never supports succession is when the rent stabilized tenant moves out or dies, they're completely gone from the apartment is empty, and then later the would-be successor moves in. I get calls all the time from people who say, oh, my dad just died and he lived alone in a rent stabilized apartment. It's a really nice apartment. Can I move in and be the rent stabilized tenant now? And the answer is no. So that's the context you need. Now let's get into today's case. Now let's get into today's case. In today's case, we had two sisters living together in a rent-stabilized apartment. Sister A was the rent-stabilized tenant, and Sister B came to live with her. She was just an occupant. Sister A bought a house and moved out. So the landlord sued Sister A, claiming that the apartment was no longer her primary residence. And the landlord also sued Sister B, saying that she had no independent right to the apartment. Sister A showed up with no lawyer and admitted that she did not live in the apartment anymore, and they discontinued the case against her. So goodbye, Sister A. Sister B, who was a senior citizen, showed up with a lawyer and said that she had succeeded to her sister's rent stabilized tenancy because they had lived together in the apartment for at least 1 year. Sister B had no trouble establishing through a whole bunch of records that she lived in the apartment as her primary residence for a long time. The question was whether she overlapped with rent stabilized tenant Sister A. And the problem was that Sister A refused to testify. So this is where it gets interesting. The landlord's lawyer asked the court to make what is known as a negative inference against Sister B. In other words, the landlord said that if Sister A was not willing to come in and testify and help her sister, the court should consider it as if Sister A's testimony would be bad for Sister B. Like Sister A would come in and say she didn't overlap for the 1 year with Sister B. The court refused to make that negative inference. The court decided that Sister B didn't control Sister A enough so that Sister A staying out of the case should look bad for Sister B. Sister A simply had no more self-interest in the matter, and she was out of it. I checked the court's website, and it looks like the case settled, and Sister B got to remain in the apartment as the rent-stabilized tenant, so congratulations to her. But this leads us to some very interesting tenant takeaways about how to protect yourself in these type of cases. But first, let's get the housekeeping out of the way. This is not legal advice and I am not your lawyer, but because I am a lawyer, this might be considered legal advertising. If this is legal advertising, it is terrible because I am asking you not to contact me. This pod is not a commercial for me or my law firm. This is simply the podcast that I always wanted to make. Email us with your questions. I might be answering listener questions on the pod, but not announcing your name. But I would like to say what New York City neighborhood you're from. If you like our work, please give us the 5 stars and pass this podcast on to your friends. It's time for the tenant takeaway. Tenant takeaway time. If you're someone who wants to someday succeed to a rent stabilized tenancy of the person you live with, your parents, your sibling, your adult child, or someone you're not related to, but you're in a family like relationship with, don't wait for that rent stabilized tenant to move out to start trying to establish that you live together. There is a DHCR form. Remember, DHCR is the state agency that oversees rent stabilization. They have a form that the rent stabilized tenant can fill out every year that helps to establish that you are there. It's called the Notice to Owner of Family Members Residing with the Named Tenant in the Apartment Who May Be Entitled to Succession Rights Protection from Eviction, Form RA 23.5. You can Google it, but I'm also going to put a link in the show notes. Also, never continue to renew a lease in the name of a tenant who left, as if you're sort of fooling the landlord. The farther away from the rent stabilized tenant's departure you get, the harder it is for you to prove that you guys overlapped with each other, as this case demonstrates. And also, depending on the court, renewing the lease in the name of someone who's not there can be considered fraud, and that can defeat your whole succession claim. We have a booklet available on the tenant learning platform. I'll also put this link in the show notes, called How to Protect Your Rent Stabilized Apartment from a Non-Primary Residence Claim. It's not exactly the succession topic, but it's close. And the booklet lists all these ways you can prove where a tenant or occupant of an apartment really resided. So check that out. And there you have it. Remember, New York City, the law belongs to you, but your ownership of the law is only as great as your understanding of the law. So let's learn to live better. I am Michelle Itkowitz, and this is the Tenant Law Podcast.